seems to be okay now. Thanks, man.
Okay.
Okay, so, very rare to see games like this, but when it does work, it's very effective. So, the most common way to see games actually relayed, story relayed in games, is the now ubiquitous cutscene. I don't know how people feel. Cutscenes, good or bad? Gnashing of teeth.
It depends.
On.
Well, how much time goes into them compared to the actual gameplay.
Mm-hmm.
For the first one. How long they last, if they add something to the story, or if it's just needless, just expositions.
Has anyone played anything where you thought the cutscenes were needlessly long?
Death Stranding.
Yeah, okay. For any game by him, by the way, they are needlessly long. Anyone think of something where cutscenes are really good? I know you mentioned Red Dead already.
I would say Halo, though, because I think, especially in things like Reach and Halo 3 in particular, those cutscenes are fantastic, because like I said earlier, the whole point of that game is not based on the characters, it's based on the setting, and then every single cutscene they do, they have establishing shots, they make you care about where you are.
Yeah.
It's always focused.
I think that focus is really good. Mass Effect Trilogy would be another example, I think, where they adopt that kind of approach to cutscenes, which works really well. Dialogue and action in a way that keeps the player in action while you're doing nothing. I think that's the key to understanding what the purpose of a cutscene is. You feel that the game is being driven forward, even though you are actually inactive. And this is where the sort of cinematic analysis of games still maintains some importance, I would argue, because cutscenes are cinematic in what they're trying to achieve. In that sense, has anyone got an example of a cutscene that they felt was completely unnecessary? The games that use cutscenes in a way that don't add. What are you thinking?
In The Witcher, there's a bit where there's a stuffed unicorn, and Geralt has sex with a woman on it.
And that's a cutscene.
Yeah.
How graphic is the cutscene?
It's pretty graphic for something that didn't drive the narrative in any way.
What's the symbolism of the unicorn in that?
Oh.
Let's do film studies for a minute. What? What's this?
Innocence, but then that would be quite
Wonder? What do unicorns symbolise usually? You know,
magic.
Magic? Is it a magical sexual encounter?
Yeah, it was with a sorceress.
Oh, there you are.
There you go. Not symbolism isn't often done well in cutscenes. To be is the point I'm making. But it's a weird. This is the effect of Grand Theft Auto. And Grand Theft Auto 4 in particular, that games feel that they should portray sex through cutscenes. And Mass Effect does it as well, but Grand Theft Auto 4 was the one that controversially did this, because you had to hack the game to actually see it. But it's like, please, you don't have to do this. You can allude to it in different ways. Cutscenes. Let's think about the structure of what a cutscene does, right? So you're watching Geralt having sex with the sorceress over a stuffed unicorn. What is it? What is the purpose of that? Why would you use that? Why does that occur? What is happening in the game at that point? Nothing, right? So, cutscenes come along and they do a couple of things. One, they stop the game, so you are no longer an active participant in what is happening in the game. You have literally stopped playing. You are now watching rather than playing, right? So why would a developer put that in?
Kind of like a reward sometimes.
Well, you can feel that way. You've played successfully, so you get a payoff in a cutscene, right? So transition is one element of the cutscene here. The cutscene works to indicate to us that the game is going to change in some way. That you have done this, that's over, you are now moving on to a different set of things that you will be doing afterwards. Okay, so I think there's a sensible element in there. It's also lazy. It's like, we can't think of how we might continue this in terms of action. So we're just going to put a cutscene here and go to something completely different. It's a way of like segmenting all the parts of a game. So they have corners around them, because you don't want to play all the way through, because that's a big developmental task. So in this way, you can divide games up into episodes of play, which means it's much easier to develop. It keeps things discrete, rather than having to keep things open, which is much more difficult. So the cutscene, really, it's presented to us as like, this is a reward for you doing this well. Well done, good boy or girl. Actually, what we're doing here is cutting the game up, because it's much, much harder for us to do as a completely openly told story within the context of what you're doing. Less complex games of the past didn't need cutscenes, simply because you could play all the way through. They were shorter, they were much less complicated, so you know there wasn't that need of a function. Please vote. I've actually included your buddy in Death Stranding as the little picture in the corner. What do you mean, no? Dare you disagree with me? Okay. Nobody thinks they ruin games. Can they ruin games?
Yeah.
Maybe that's a more nuanced way of asking that question. How?
If they're overused or maybe put in places that don't need cutscenes just because it's like a get out of jail card or something like that.
I think that's a very nuanced point. It's the use of cutscenes which is really problematic. If the story is overly concerned with using cutscenes, you tend to see them very, very often in ways that disjoint the experience of what you're trying to do. So and there are a number of games that do this, and it's a sign of poor game design if you have a lot of cutscenes, especially that turn up at times where you as a player don't want them to turn up, because it breaks really flow and that element of Csikszentmihalyi's Hailey's notion of being in that flow state. If you're continually being taken out of it by cut, that's an indication that the story has been poorly designed and the game has been poorly designed itself. And it's often a way of trying to make a game look better than it is by continually having this cinematic aspect of it as well. There's no real reason for cutscenes to ruin games, and they are a really, really effective way of driving story. There's a reason why just about every game uses cutscenes in this day and age, because they're an incredibly effective way of powering story along. Especially when you're doing, even for this assignment you're doing now, if you consider cutscenes in that assignment, but especially in the game analysis essay, I want you to pay attention very carefully to how the story unfolds. It may not be the focus of your essay, but it does tell you a lot about the game itself, how cutscenes are used, because that will tell you a hell of a lot about how it was designed. If there's overuse of cutscenes, it meant that the story was seen as being more important than the actual game itself, the experience of playing. It's a compensation to draw away from some of the deficiencies of gameplay. If you see very few cutscenes and you actually don't think there's enough to power the story along, the reverse is probably true, that there was too much attention paid to the gameplay aspect and not enough to the story itself and how to push that forward. So it's almost trying to find the sweet spot of that is really, really difficult. Now, Characters, incredibly important in terms of story. So just picking up on all the elements Morgan gave right at the beginning, basically. Characters. We have different types of character in a game, and basically we can think of them as 5 different types. Stage characters, which are just a part of the scenario but don't do much. Functional characters, which have a function in the game. This is traditionally what we think of as non-playable characters, in that we interact with them. Cast characters are seen as significant in the story but may not be functional characters in any way, shape or form. Play characters, us, and iconic characters which serve empty of personality but serve some kind of function themselves. And you don't tend to see many iconic characters anymore in games. They tend to have dropped off. Now, developers usually make them into functional characters. And dialogue is usually the way that we interact with these characters in some way. Talking to NPCs uncovers plot lines and context, as well as giving quests in games. So, how do games power story forward? You develop characters. Not just our character, but the characters around you as well. Character, therefore, is incredibly important. And creating believable, rounded, and interesting characters is very often critically important in how we appreciate the story of a game. If non-playable characters in particular are badly created, the game tends to not be well received. So, give me an example. Great character in a game that plays an essential role in a story that isn't playable. I don't want to hear about Ellie, I don't want to hear about Arthur, I don't want to hear about the myriad of cutouts that serve as characters in Grand Theft Auto. So none of them are believable. Why?
Well, first off, he explains like the majority of the backstory in certain areas where you don't understand anything, because he's meant to be, he's meant to have connections to pretty much every single person, but it's not turned on him, they turned on him, but everybody has this horrible opinion of him. But everything he explains to you as the player kind of gives you an understanding of everything that goes on, and then also kind of shifts certain dialogue that happens with certain characters, and it gives you impressions about people before you've met them. And it's really interesting that he's shown immediately to be this poor man who's in prison, free him, that's all great. And every single person who meets him is pretty much like, I'm glad you're just ahead, spits on him, all these other things. And he's meant to be another part of one of the heroes, so I think he's a really interesting character.
Character that serves a critical function in you understanding your place in the game world, understanding what it is that you need to do in the game world, and allows you to understand the other characters in the game through that character's interaction with those other characters. So it's nothing to do with you as a player interacting with any other characters. They interact. So you develop the story through a development of that character and a deepening of that character and your understanding of it. It's almost a perfect example of how a non-playable character can work to drive narrative.
It's even better that he isn't even got a body, so it all, it's all come through dialogue. There's no fights or anything like that. It's all just simply.
Absolutely.
It's more like a narrator than an actual character at times.
Yeah. Lester is a really interesting character in Grand Theft Auto 5 because he's really annoying. His voice gets on my nerves, and he's so whiny and moany, but it plays, if you want to consider Grand Theft Auto 5 as having a good narrative, I'm not convinced it does, but if you want to consider it, he's absolutely critical to it, because all the heists are basically down to him. So you get all the function of what you have to do if you wish to play through that narrative. I know a lot of people don't bother. I think only like 18% of people have ever finished that game. If you look at trophies on various platforms, I think it's about 18%, something like that. So a lot of people don't even bother. But Lester's really critical to that. But it's interesting because he's not a sympathetic character in any way, shape. He's a bit of a scumbag, to be fair. Dutch. I can't stand Dutch.
Me too.
He's got no redeeming features at all. He's an idiot. It's the whole like third act of that game is about how Dutch is going to save the group, and he always does so. And you know he's got an idea, and all of his ideas are shit beyond belief. It's every plan he's got to like make the group better. It's like you're playing it and you think, this is what are you doing? No, I want to go. I don't. It's really important in that sense, in distancing Arthur from the group. Dutch's arc works to make you feel not part of that scenario anymore, because you can actually, it's deliberate, right? You're looking at it and thinking, this guy is a fucking idiot. This guy doesn't know what he's doing. His ideas are really bad. He's going to get me killed. He doesn't even like me. I'm developing tuberculosis. You know, I'm half dead. This guy's a prick. That's really important in terms of driving the narrative structure of the game forward, because the third act is all about decoupling from the group. You know, Arthur's redemption tale as finding what's important in life is, you know, that he stops being an outlaw, right? Samantha, explain.
So in like basically the start of like Willow Black Ops, she kind of just like a character no one really knows. She's more like hinted towards with Easter eggs. And then end of Black Ops 1, you finally meet her. Then she basically tells her the whole story then of war. Black Ops 1, then she's in Black Ops 2 and 3, and she basically narrates the whole story to you.
So, that's interesting, because what is the purpose of having the same NPC in different games?
So she introduces the story.
It's that straightforward. It links. It's the purpose of doing this is to create that notion of a narrative suite between episodes. In a sense, that means that the series becomes episodic, which is it's important for two things. One, it allows a narrative to unfold over multiple games. I think it's an interesting design choice because it kind of both limits and structures what you're going to do in future games if you have NPCs that flow across different games. Classically, again, the Zelda series is a wonderful example of this, where you have the same NPCs, therefore you can continue, you get a sense of continuity of narrative across the time of the games. Really going back now 35 years, you know, where there's a discernible storyline that runs through them all because you have the same NPCs in it. And I think in contemporary games, it allows us to stitch things together in particular ways. I'm often convinced that that's not something that game designers think about. They drop like reusable NPCs in because they find it helpful to actually write the story around them, rather than writing something fresh and original, which is hard. You know, that's a difficult thing to do. If you use the same NPCs over time, you don't have to do that. You know, you can literally do it. In a sense, it's kind of lazy, and when done well, it can be really effective. But at times also you can think, oh, please get some new ideas. You know, and so it's a difficult one to balance. Another aspect that we have to consider is how narrative is organised. So video game writers allow for moderate branching while implementing plot bottlenecks to allow story to develop and advance. That would be my summary of exactly how video games are written. Moderate branching is something which traditional media texts don't allow. You get linear form in film and television. We're not allowed to branch in different ways because we're not in control of the narrative in any way. You know, we just sit and receive. So in terms of narrative structure, you always have two parts: the structure itself referring to the progression of the story, and the portrayal of how the game conveys or shows that story. Within those two elements, you can use games to actually modify the narrative structure a little bit. So basically we have three types of narratives that can occur. First is linear, where it's a structure basically found in other mediums such as literature and film. And they can almost only use this model. So in a linear narrative, the story progresses from one event to another in a single straight line with no deviation, backtracking or skipping ahead. In games, linear narrative means you don't have any interaction with the story. The story will just unfold through your actions themselves. And you can't actually alter the story through the way you play the game. Basically, you can only complete the game in one way. Now, traditionally, this was still, if you want to think about, why did people think narrative was important in the 90s of games? Games in the 90s were basically like this. There was a linear way of playing it. So, I'm a big Sonic the Hedgehog fan, right? There's only one way to play Sonic the Hedgehog. There is only one way to finish it. There is no way you can branch out into different things. Level by level, you go from beginning to end. The story as exists in that game, which is skeletal to say the best, it just unfolds by progress. You go level, 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 level. Final boss, bang. All your little furry friends are released from their metal prisons, and the world goes back to being green and pretty and flowers and shit. Thinking about it in that terms, why the hell do I even like that game? That is completely antithetic to my message. But maybe I yearn for beauty. I don't know. Linear, basically, historically linear has been was the way the games were played, really until I'd say the mid-90s, when that generation of consoles allowed for different narrative structures to emerge. It's a function of two elements. Processors, so you allow games to become more complex because you have more capacity for actually making complex graphics, complex story, use of cutscenes, etc. And two, and the thing that we overlook most often, is actually storage. How were games stored in the 80s? Does anyone, I know you guys weren't around, but...
Cartridges.
Most popularly, cartridges. You had a couple of other forms as well. There was a mad system that came out in the early 80s where you could play games on vinyl. Look that up. It is as insane as it looks. I think it was a plug-in for the Commodore 64 where you could have vinyl games. It did not work. Cassette was even worse because cassettes sucked big time. Cartridges, do you know, I'll give you a system and you try and tell me what the largest cartridge ever made was in terms of storage for it, okay? Mm-hmm. So, Sega Mega Drive, 88 to, 97 when they discontinued it. Do you know, don't go looking this up, what the largest size of a cartridge was?
What, like the biggest
I'll give you a clue,
game?
right? Cartridge sizes could only be in multiples of 8. So you had 8, 16, 32, 64, etc.
It was 16-bit.
The computer was 16-bit. Yeah. Cartridge was how much information you could store for a game. 64 megabits. Now, we don't measure in megabits anymore. We measure in gigabytes. 64 megabits, I have to do my maths carefully here, but on a 1 gigabyte hard drive, you could fit a 64 megabit game, I'm thinking about 1 million times. About 1 million games you could put on something of that size. The games were tiny. In terms of storage, what you could actually put on a chip to play, games in the 80s and 90s were minuscule. Which is why I can download the entire back catalogue of Super Nintendo games, put them on an SD card, plug them into an emulator and play them, and play anything that was ever released for that. And guess what? I've still got 98% of storage on my SD card. You know, the ISD card is quite happy with that little load of history on it. Linear suited storage. When you had games that small, linear suited it. Now, CD-based games started to come out around about 1992, which exponentially increased the size that you could do with games, and therefore increased the possibilities of what you could do in terms of design. All of a sudden, you could make bigger, which meant that you could have different narratives. You didn't have to be linear. CD games really proliferate throughout the 90s, and it's the, I guess, 99, 2000 is where you start to see DVD-based games. Again, vastly larger than CDs. And now we're in the era of Blu-ray based optical media. Although, within the next few years, I genuinely think nobody will be selling discs in 3 years. It just doesn't make any sense anymore. They're too expensive to produce when you can digitally download anything. It doesn't make any sense for the manufacturers anymore. You'll still have a market for like steel books, I think, of games, you know, where collectors want to do this, but the idea of going to Game and buying something, which is going to suck for Game as a company, but then they suck anyway. The Game is, they closed the one in Swansea.
Yeah.
And now it's in like Sports Direct.
Even that's closed now.
Is it closed? Oh, no, there's a new Sports Direct in Park Towie.
Oh.
It's horrendous. It is like the worst shop I've ever been in. Everyone in there looks like they're going to stab you. Alright. The String of Pearls model is where the story is told in a linear fashion but can be interrupted. So there are junction points in the game where you can branch off to do other things. This is a structure which is unique to video games, and I would add, I think is the most popular structure that there is for video games as well. The idea that the story, okay, so Red Dead Redemption 2 is a great example of this, where the story unfolds actually in a very linear fashion, but in the meantime you can go off and do hunting missions, or you can do robberies, or etc. You have other branches off which you can concentrate on for a little while and then return to the main narrative itself. So I think this is actually the most common form of game that we get at the moment, where the main narrative unfolds in a linear fashion, but we are given other things that we can do. And my problem with this is it's uninventive. It's like the hunting thing. Why does every game these days want you to go and hunt animals? There's something wrong about this. I like animals. I don't want to kill them, but I'm always told, like, you know, go and hunt a bear. I was like, the fucking bear alone. You know, I don't want to kill the bear. You know, and it's always like bears and crocodiles. It doesn't tell you, like, go and hunt, you know, Tiddles the cat. Then you wouldn't fucking do it, right? You know, go hunt your dog, your nice cute little, you know. They don't ask you to do that, you know, roast it afterwards. You know, stop being, it's uninventive and not perverted enough. You know, which, yeah, it's not good. RPGs, classically, this is the format, I think. And historically, RPGs played in this way as well. And it occurs to me that nearly all games these days are RPGs. It doesn't, even something like Call of Duty, it is an RPG at the end of the day. You're asked to play a particular role in a particular way. Nearly everything is. Witcher, they're RPG games. You know, and Final Fantasy calls itself an RPG game. I'd love to know what the difference between playing Final Fantasy and playing The Witcher is, in terms of how you inhabit the character. Because, as far as I'm concerned, you're being asked to play a role in a particular way. And you customise. And, you know, the things that we've always seen classically in RPG games, like Final Fantasy or Zelda or whatever, that's now the dominant way of actually every game being, as far as I'm concerned. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a fucking RPG. There's no question in my mind. That's an RPG game, right? You might not market it in that way, and they certainly wouldn't market it in that way, but undoubtedly, that's what you've been asked to do. So I got Dying Light 2, I picked up on this weekend. I'm looking at it and thinking, it's another RPG. You know? Okay, it's got zombies. I might be interested in killing zombies because I like killing zombies, but at the end of the day, it's another RPG game. It's almost as if the RPG won as a genre. When you had a transference to 3D graphics in the 90s. You swept away platform games and fighting games and beat 'em up games because they don't work in 3D particularly well. What genres were left standing? Well, sports games were still there, and RPGs were still there. And basically everything from that point became an RPG. You know, all games ostensibly take elements of RPG, and they either lean in big time, so you actually know that it's an RPG game, or they simply present something which structurally is this kind of narrative, which tells you it's basically a role-playing game. Anything which branches in this way, you are being asked to inhabit a particular role. You're given a certain amount of freedom in this structure, but it is a limited amount of freedom. The freedom to choose when you branch off to do stuff. But in order to complete, you still have to re-engage with a linear narrative. So, in that sense, the freedom here is a little bit misleading, in that you're not really free, you're still tied to the narrative itself. A fully branching story is something that can occur. Full story-based games, but there are so few of these that I almost think they're a novelty in themselves. I know nobody is actually talking about one in an assignment. Anyone got any examples of something which is just a full story game which could go off in any kind of direction? What do you think?
Detroit Gone Human, is that what it's called?
That's really interesting. I think that's linear.
Why?
Because, have you played it?
Big bits of it.
I got bored with it really quickly because I didn't feel like I had any choice in things to do. So Detroit Become Human.
That's it.
It came out it's a few years ago it came out now. It looks amazing still. It was a PS4 game.
Came out
It
2018.
looks incredible. But that's a weird one because I'd go the other way and say that's entirely linear. The reason why I got bored with it is it's all cutscenes. There's nothing else in it. And the activity that you do is very often, press triangle at this point. It's like, I want to do a little bit more than press fucking triangle. But it doesn't offer me any freedom as far as, although you can branch and choose different, so I get why you think that structure is there. I think it's an interesting one, is that it offers you a series of linear choices. So you could have perhaps 3 or 4 different ways of playing it through a story, but you can't do anything about those stories once the choice has been made. The equivalent for me would be Bandersnatch, the Black Mirror episode where people are like, oh, this is amazing, you can choose how it... No, you can't. There are like 3 different films here. You just make a choice at one point and you get given one or the other. You don't have anything to do with how that story unfolds at all. You can go back and watch it again to see the other version or the other version of that, and I think that's how Detroit works. You play it through and then you can go right back to the beginning and make a different choice and you will see another version of it, but I don't know what agency you have in how that unfolds. But it's a really interesting narrative game in that sense. One that I would never play because I just feel completely disempowered by it.
What about Until Dawn? Is that in the same band?
Probably better than, in terms of how you can...
But from my understanding...
has anyone played it? Until Dawn?
No.
No, I'm loath to comment because I haven't played it. I know what you mean, but I've never got around to it.
Because I know it's something very much like Detroit where it's all choice-based, but it's a lot more open of a game anyway, you have a lot more things to do, and every single choice you make has a completely different consequence, and there are, I think there's 8 different endings.
Yeah, this notion of different ending is really interesting to me because it makes us think that we're operating in this fully sort of branching environment, and maybe that there's some truth to that. The linearity of things is taken out of it. Maybe, Morgan, there is an argument to suggest that Detroit is this kind of game. I think it draws out one of the limitations of what games can do in this structure, in that, okay, we do have different ways of branching right from the outset, but that doesn't necessarily make the game more interesting because there's still an imposed linearity in it to make something. The classic ones like this are online role-playing games, where there's the idea that you go into it and then everything unfolds through your activity, and because the space is wide enough that ostensibly you can decide to join this or join that or do this or do that, or ostensibly do nothing. And you could just have cycle behaviour, like go and kill a load of pigs in World of Warcraft. In that kind of space, I guess there's the possibility of branching narrative, but what I would say about branching narrative is it's very rare. It's almost not something that game designers want to do, because the effort that goes into it, like you said earlier, Chester, the effort that is required to make something sustainable in that structure is so big. So it's like, why would you bother doing, this is going to cost too much money, unless you've like 100 million online players who are paying $20 a month. Then I can think, oh yeah, there's money in here, But otherwise, why would you bother? I was going to ask that question, but I'm going to jump forward. In terms of narrative, RPGs, I didn't just witter on about them for no reason. So Henry Jenkins, why are we familiar with the name Henry Jenkins?
Because he's everywhere in media.
What is he important for in media studies?
For me, fandoms.
Yes.
Yeah.
The overarching name for that is?
Fan culture.
Comes under an even bigger heading. Participatory culture.
That's it.
That's his major concept, right? For Jenkins, RPGs are modes of collaboration. Many games construct immersive worlds through spatial and environmental storytelling, relies on pre-existing associations within popular media. So what Jenkins draws our attention to is this notion of collaboration is about us bringing a history to the table in order for it to be meaningful. So therefore, the structure of games that we play must tap into a shared cultural collective experience. If something is outside of that, the story will not work for us, according to Jenkins. So he's kind of where I got that argument from, that all games are basically RPGs now. But in order for RPGs to work in that sense, we have to have a pre-existing cultural understanding of what's going in. So, if this works, then games enable gamers to enact a certain narrative, and that makes us the narrative architect. We can drive the story forwards in our own heads if we have sufficient cues to link the game itself to our pre-existing knowledge and pre-existing cultural knowledge of what should happen. And I mean, classically, this is what happens with cinema. This is one of the reasons why, you have generic cinema. It's not just because that makes it easier to make and, it's popular and so on. It means we don't go in cold. We know roughly what to expect from a horror movie. We know roughly what to expect from a science fiction movie, from a superhero movie, from a chick flick, from a rom-com. We know the archetypes of these things. We're culturally sensitive to them. It means it means the filmmaker doesn't have to do a lot of storytelling, effectively, in a lot of the sense, because we can fill in the gaps, right? So Jenkins draws our attention to how games do this. Games tell stories in unique ways, and he argues that they're evoked narratives. They're worlds that we know through our other media experiences. So I use the example of Snatcher here. Why did Kojima do this? Well, he banked on there would be a whole bunch of gamers in the 90s who would have watched the Terminator films, would have watched Blade Runner, would be familiar with the milieu that takes place in. Therefore, although the game is very good at telling a story, he doesn't have to tell the whole story. He doesn't have to tell the massive story of why the world is as it is, because he's assuming you've seen the Terminator, right? Machines are going to take over, there's going to be an apocalypse, this is after that. I don't have to tell you all of that because you've already seen it. So we have enacted narratives when story comes through activities, but evoked narratives, things that the game picks up on, which we fill the back details in for, are also extremely important. Embedded narratives is where the game space becomes a memory palace for the player and the narrative. That comes through play. And emergent narratives is when the game space is rich with narrative potential. So for Jenkins, there are 4 kinds of narrative that work within games. Games are the only media that has these 4, that can combine all of them. Evoked narratives are very common. Enacted narratives really are unique to games. Embedded narratives, I think film uses embedded narrative in a big way, but in games it works slightly different. And emergent narratives really is a feature of games also. So for Jenkins, games themselves have different narrative potential. On that subject, if we talk about evoked narratives, one of the key words is repertoire. Now, Isa looks exclusively at the Resident Evil series. What do the Resident Evil series ask us to have? Okay, these games, there's what, 9 of them? There's actually way more than that because they did loads of little crappy ones as well. What do these games rely on? Knowledge of the horror genre, horror films, action films, and how to cheat at games. And this is always the interesting one for me. How to cheat. Why do you think he says how to cheat is an important part of repertoire?
Because the early games are insanely difficult.
They were. Why were they insanely difficult? What are you asked to do in the Resident Evil games? Everyone asks the same thing at the end of the day. They're all basically got the same structure. You're asked to escape. The whole point of those games is to get out of the shit situation that you're in. Does it make it easy for you?
No.
No. So basically, you're presented with a game space where everything seems closed off. So your instant thing is, right, I don't know how to do this, so I have to cheat. So you've tried to find ways of cheating around the game. That's actually the game mechanic. Try and find ways to cheat your way out of the situation that you're in. This is a very powerful sense of, you know, how action games in particular work, that you're asked to try and break what's been given to you so you can somehow get out of the situation. Basically, our repertoire is activated by cues in the game and cues outside of the game as well. This often draws attention to how games are presented on Twitch, how games are presented on YouTube, where we understand what we're going to be asked to do in the game by looking at the game itself being played by others, being spoken about by others. This activates what we think the game is going to be. You know, Resident Evil, when it first came out, what did I think? Where did my head go straight away? Well, you know, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, those 80s zombie movies. I was thinking, I know roughly what I'm going to be asked to do here. So I already know this. I can play on these tropes. And it's like, how do they get out of the situation in Dawn of the Dead? They find a way to the roof. I was like, oh, that game is going to ask me. So instantly when I'm playing it, I'm thinking, go up. Because in all zombie movies, they all try to escape from the top. So I instantly know that the game is going to be vertical in terms of how it works. So I'm always primed to look, how do I get to the next level up? Always. Subverts it a little bit by then making me go into the fucking basement. Because you know in horror movies that you're not supposed to go in the basement as well, which is not great. But and that's really where the horror aspect of the game is rooted, I think. So repertoire, we fill in narrative gaps with our own knowledge. That means that game writers don't have to write everything, because they can rely on us making certain conventions. So you think about Far Cry 5. That asks the player to do a huge amount of heavy lifting in terms of the story. So you've got this like military American cult, you know, super right wing. It's kind of a commentary on militia culture in America and their, you know, Trumpism and so on. It doesn't tell you anything about why they're like that. it gives you nothing on that at all. It says it's just these random yahoos in Montana who've decided to start a cult. You have to do all that work. So if you stood back and you didn't know about any of this stuff, you'd be like, I don't really care. Who the fuck are these people? Is that hail? Holy shit. I gotta go get coffee in a minute. That is not good. Good luck. Basically, the idea of repertoire is that we activate heuristics to fill in the gap. Now, a heuristic is just a posh way of saying a mental shortcut. We use things like stereotypes, knowledge of culture, knowledge of film, knowledge of literature, in order to fill in the gaps that the video game maker has left for us. This does two things. One, it makes the game easier to develop, and two, it allows us to feel like we have invested in the meaning of the story itself, which again is another aspect of our immersion in that space. So we feel, it's like Oregon Trail, right? Do we know, I mean, the Oregon Trail is a real thing. You know, it existed. Do we know much about that? No. But we have a cultural history of like people in wagons going across the American West, and we kind of know before we play it, some of them die, you know, and they might get attacked, and they got to cross rivers and all this sort of stuff. You kind of fill in. Oregon Trail is masterful for it because it hasn't got much space to tell a story, so it relies a lot on this kind of cultural history of what we have about that time. We do a lot of the storytelling to ourselves. Although when you're playing it, it doesn't really feel that way. It feels like the story's been given to you, but you're actually making a lot of that around it. You know? Another essential thing which you need to consider if you're thinking about character, in particular in the essays, is this notion of autobiography. Not auto, important, autobiography. In games, the story unfolds as we act, we've said this a few times today, and we actually construct an ongoing story that develops through our interactions with the game world. And my example of this is an actual screenshot of me playing from the game Road Rash from 1991. This motherfucker is Viper. Viper is a non-playable character in the game Road Rash. I hate Viper. Viper and me do not get on. Viper, I'm player A, by the way. I couldn't be asked to change my name. Viper and me have a history. Right? For 30 years, Viper has been trying to kick me off my bike. That son of a bitch. I get really close up to like winning, and Viper comes along and tries to boot me or punch me off my bike. Every time. For 30 years, this has been going on. In this instance, I've taken a club off another cyclist before meeting Viper, and I've just hit him with the club. His power has gone down to about 1/3. I guarantee if I rolled this on for you, you would see me hit him again, and Viper would be on the ground in a pool of blood while I roar off into inevitable victory, because after 30 years of playing the same game, you get kind of good at it. There is no me here. That is just, there's no even story to this game, okay? Viper isn't real. I have invented a whole thing about this character over time. Me and Viper have a long history. Viper doesn't, there is no Viper. And I mean this in the barest of bones. All he has is a name. That's it. Nothing else. He is identical to every other NPC in the game, with the exception of he has been given the name Viper. I hate Viper. Every time I play Road Rash, I make it my business on every track in every race to kick that guy's ass. I have invented an entire rich storyline about how Viper is basically, you know, a puppy-killing paedophile over the years, in order to justify me whooping his ass on a regular basis. Let me reiterate, Viper does not exist. There is no Viper. There is no such thing. Never has been. I, through my interactions with this, let's be fair, look at the graphics, fairly limited world, right? Have created there's basically an autobiography going on here. I have totally created from scratch an entire person with a history of sexual offending to both animals and children in order to justify my behaviour in the game. When I get a chain, I really go to town on it. Am I mental?
Yeah.
What do you mean, yes? How dare you? I don't know, I might well be. Is this normal? It is fairly normal behaviour, this, to actually create an autobiography for myself as well. I've got a history in that game. It's like, I don't. That's not how it works. But I have created this, you know? Autobiography is an extremely important part of narrative of games, which emphasises one thing that I want to take you all to take away from this when you think about narrative in games. Autobiography is entirely from me. The game designer has given me nothing to work with there. I have gone off and through my own cultural history and level of psychosis, I've created autobiographies of things within games. And not just Road Rash, hundreds of games over the years where I've actually done this. You know, where I've added to the story myself. Narrative in games is presented to us, but we add on top of it. We tell ourselves stories of it. In particular, in limited sort of storylines, we add ourselves. But even in rich storylines, we develop our own, you know, sense of narrative within those contexts as well. This is why I guess game studies is not a domain of English literature at the end of the day, because it can't take into account interactivity, and it can't take into account how we work to develop games through that interactivity. My interactivity with Viper creates Viper. What Viper is meaningful to me comes through our interactivity together. As I mean, using the words together, it doesn't exist. It's just the way the game was programmed. But I've created a character. This is how narrative operates differently, and why ostensibly games aren't just narrative as well. It's also about play. Okay. Strike this week to Thursday and Friday, and next Wednesday, which limits what we can be doing. So, this Wednesday afternoon, I am around. If anyone wants to come in on Wednesday afternoon to talk about their assignments, I will be in my office all Wednesday afternoon. From about 1 onwards, I should be free to do so. Also goes for dissertations.
Yeah.
How did you get on in the end?